hiccups here in the last minute. So I lost some slides that you're going to see, but apparently Andrew's telling me we're good to go online. So if you're watching it from home, you're going to see the slides just fine. I like to pace when I talk, so we'll see how this works. Tonight's presentation is on a saint that's very dear to my heart, St. John Maximovitch, St. John of San Francisco. I wanted to make a few simple points to understand him, because when we go over his life, there are a lot of interesting stories, beautiful teachings. It was very hard for me to even synthesize all the testimonies in any sort of presentation. I actually need like a couple presentations. And I remember years ago reading the personal recollections of a woman who labored with him in Paris for many years, because he was the Archbishop of Western Europe for a number of years in the 50s. And I think I was in college when I read these things. It was published in the Orthodox Word. I can't find it right now. And those recollections were just so warm and so moving, gave such a spiritual portrait of this extraordinary man. And he really was an extraordinary man. How did I come to know him? I grew up in the Bay Area. And people who grew up in the Bay Area, we used to visit his sepulcher, which was underneath the San Francisco Cathedral. This was before he was any sort of an official saint. But people knew about him and came to venerate him from all over the world. And by the way, that's how sanctity grows in the Orthodox Church. Some of the greatest saints, even contemporary saints, St. Seraphim of Sarov, St. Xenia of Petersburg, St. John. But St. Xenia, she was uncanonized for over a century, as was St. Seraphim of Sarov. And yet you can't stop their veneration. There's something charismatic about it. There's something in what we would call in scholarship the sensus fidelium. There's a sense in the faithful. There's something in the heart of the faithful that rings true. So that's one thing. How did he achieve this kind of worldwide veneration? Well, let me put this in a little bit of perspective. St. John lived among this, what we call the interbellica generation, the generation between the world wars. This generation was extraordinary in its intellectual and spiritual gifts. In the Orthodox Church, for example, among the theologians, we have George Florovsky, we have Dumitru Stăniloae, we have Lasky, we have Nikolai Velimirovich, Justin Popovich. By the way, many of these people knew St. John personally. Okay, among all of these people who wrote things and had an extraordinary voice among subsequent generations, St. John wrote a few things, but he didn't write a lot. We'll get into some of the things he wrote. And he spent most of his pastorship in Shanghai, China. Okay? Rather isolated and indeed truly completely out of contact with the wider church for almost a decade. And yet we're here talking about him, and everybody knows about him, and everywhere you go in the world he's venerated. So how did I come to know him? Well, when you grew up as a kid in the Bay Area, you visited the sepulcher. That was just a thing to do among, if you're Orthodox nerd teen. And it was an amazing place. In fact, when they moved him, when they took his relics in 1993 and they put him in the upstairs cathedral for his canonization in the sarcophagus, some people missed that, being able to go underneath the cathedral. And I think I mentioned in a sermon a little while ago that nobody's buried in San Francisco. There's no room for cemeteries. There's only one exception to that, and that's St. John. And he was buried underneath the cathedral in this beautifully frescoed chapel. And his sarcophagus was exactly in the center of this room. There was no altar, there was no iconostasis. I have a picture of it if it survived the data crash. It survived on Andrew's Google Drive thing, but it didn't on mine. You'll be able to see the original sepulcher. It was frescoed by a man named Pimen Safronov, who was one of the eminent iconographers of the Russian emigre. So you used to go and you'd pray, you'd kneel at his tomb, you'd pray, you could kiss his mitre. Sometimes they put some of his vestments out, and you took home a little bottle of holy oil. And we would anoint ourselves, well, on certain occasions, for example, if you didn't quite study hard enough for a calculus exam, the St. John oil came out, okay? So he was kind of like the patron saint of students. So the simple point I wanted to make to answer my own question, how did he come to such a notoriety in the souls of the faithful? Here's a simple way of answering that. The saints of the church do in heaven, in the presence of God, what they did on earth, but in a different manner. And they really exemplify the fact that we are one body and that we are one spirit. Okay, and within this body where they labored so zealously for the faithful, for their fellow Christian, and this man did it like no other. Not neglecting a certain person, a single person, always being sensitive, conscious, attentive, thoughtful, and sacrificial in the way that he addressed the needs of the faithful. He's doing the same thing now, but on a different level. Is it not the same with all the saints? Okay, God is not the God of the dead, he's the God of the living, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Who appeared on Mount Tabor with Christ? Moses and Elijah. What did they talk about? The gospel tells us his impending death. In other words, they weren't talking about heavenly realities. They were talking about the trials here on earth. That's where their attention was focused with the faithful, just as it was when they were on earth. Did not the Lord appear to Saul of Tarsus from the other world? His concern still with the trials and tribulations of the faithful. Okay, so St. John simply continues to do what he always did. And I mentioned this also previously. He had an extraordinary life, one that you just could not make up, and which I'm going to tell you up front I'm not going to do justice to tonight. Okay, but he served as a hierarch on every continent. Now, the exception might be South America. I don't know if he went to South America, but I wouldn't doubt it, because they had a very strong emigre presence in many places in the countries of South America. I think that's unprecedented. He served in Europe, in Asia, in Australia, in North Africa and Tunisia, and in Morocco, Western Europe, and the United States. Okay? None of it was his own doing or his own desire. In fact, I would say that on more than one occasion, and this was evident in those recollections of the woman in Paris, he was asked to leave a beloved flock that he did not want to leave. Okay, but the synod moved him. They had another need. Okay, so let's start talking about him. And at the end of each section, I'll go through some slides. St. John was born on June 4th, 1896, in the village of Anamakova in the province of Kharkov. Kharkov is in the Donetsk province of Ukraine, where this battle is raging right now, but at that time it was in the Russian Empire. He was the oldest of 6 children, and he was named Michael at baptism. His father, Boris, who died in 1954, was a marshal of the Russian nobility, and his mother, Glafira, was a daughter of a medical inspector. The Maximovitch family became part of the Little Russian nobility in the year 1690. So his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather became a member of the nobility. And this man's name was Maxim Vasilkovsky, excuse me. And one of his 7 sons, became the Metropolitan of Tobolsk in Siberia. And that man was canonized in the year 1916 as a saint. He died in 1715, St. John of Tobolsk. And his incorrupt relics are in the cathedral to this day. So another interesting fact, interesting also is that St. John of Tobolsk translated, he was a church writer and a poet. He translated a book on the spiritual life, a classic from Latin, called Heliotropion. Has anybody heard of that book? Father Paul? Heliotropium, which means sunflower in Latin. And what it is a book about is adjusting our mentality, our feelings, our emotions to the will of God. And it was also translated by Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, St. Nicodemus. So an interesting fact about the area he grew up in, there was the Monastery of the Protection of the Mother of God, and underneath its cathedral altar, there was a frescoed grotto in which the previous Archbishop, Milady Leontovich, died in 1841. He was buried in this frescoed grotto underneath the cathedral altar of the Protection Monastery. And people used to go, he was not a canonized saint, and pray for his help and have Malebens done. And so this man was venerated by St. John as a youth. He also had a particular ascetic practice. This man spent the whole night in prayer and would not sleep in a bed. He also foreknew his own death. So St. John was similar to him in these 3 respects, that he was buried in a grotto under the altar of his cathedral, that he prayed for the faithful all night, and he did not sleep in a bed. Milady was canonized in 1978, and his relics are now in the Kharkov Cathedral. So St. John attended a rather famous school, the Poltava Military Academy, and he attended that from 1907 to 1914. That was established by Peter the Great after a big military victory there. And the chaplain, you just can't make this up. It's just like one famous person after another crosses paths with St. John. But the chaplain of this basically military high school for boys, was Archpriest Sergei Chetverikov. Father Sergei Chetverikov is actually an accomplished scholar. He wrote a very important study, for example, on Paisius Velichkovsky. And it's translated in English. I think St. Vlad's published it. So St. John acknowledged the influence of this special priest in his sermon when he became a bishop. And Father Sergei, who was there, I believe, for 10 years as the chaplain, he had incredible things to say. But I wanted to repeat one thing. He said this about these years being the best of his life. He said, in Russia today, and he's talking about Russia right at the time before the revolution, that was a dicey period. It wasn't like everybody walking around was a saint. He said, the only wholesome schools left are the military academies, even more so than the theological seminaries. They instill piety, faith in God, a love for the country, the fatherland, he probably said, a sense of duty and responsibility to others, loyalty to the Tsar, discipline and respect. In short, it gives the students a holistic and clear-cut identity. I thought that was beautiful. I wanted to repeat it. So in Kharkov, as a young man, St. John graduated in 1914, and he wanted to go to the Kiev Theological Academy, and his father forbade it. Told him, you're going to study law. So he entered the Kharkov Imperial University in the Faculty of Law, and he graduated in 1918, right before the school was closed by the Soviets. When he graduated from high school in 1914, Kharkov received a new archbishop, a younger archbishop. That archbishop was, anyone? I know some of you might know. Anthony Krepovitsky. So Anthony Krepovitsky was an extraordinary ecclesiastical figure, sometimes controversial. But he, at one time or another, was the head of, I believe, all three major theological academies in Russia. And he was actually elected Metropolitan of Kiev in 1918 when the previous Metropolitan died suddenly. But the Soviets would not approve his election. So he eventually, like most people at that period, they were arrested, they were freed, they were arrested, they were freed, they went here, they went there. And then he went in this mass exodus from Crimea to Constantinople, and eventually in 1920 arrived in Serbia, and that's where he remained. And he became, because he was the highest ranking hierarch of the bishops that left Russia, he became head of the Provisional Synod, which would become the Russian Church abroad. So some commentators have noted that because St. John was obedient to his father and received a law degree, he had the training that he needed later in life when he basically manifested a superhuman effort to convince the U.S. Congress to bring his flock from the Philippines to San Francisco, and in many other legal disputes that he had while in Shanghai. Now, just a forewarning, I went a little bit deep into the weeds over the situation in Shanghai. And because I'm trying to do all of this in what is it, 45 minutes? Is that my limit? I might not get into all the details about what he did with the U.S. government. But all the main personalities of the era were involved in that, including Douglas MacArthur. It's really extraordinary. Okay, so he graduated from law school, and he worked for a brief time in the Kharkov District Court. And then he was, like many of his generation, he was arrested, he was let go, he was arrested, he was let go. So he went with his family, they went to Crimea, and his family actually left on the last steamboat to Constantinople as the Red Army was entering the city. Their luggage was stolen because St. John happened to be reading the gospel, not watching the luggage. And the family got into a tugboat because the steamer was full and just departed. So they got into a tugboat to chase it, and the captain would not let them on board because the ship was full. And so finally he said, so what family do you come from? They said, Maximovitch. He goes, I'm a Maximovitch, let him on the ship. And so he went to with his family. They were in Constantinople for a year. And then finally they went to Belgrade. Now, 70,000 Russians were in Belgrade. And Serbia was the only country that welcomed the Russians. And there are all types of accounts of how gracious they were with these refugees. Basically gave them a free hand. Let them settle there, buy homes. The patriarch at the time, Varnava, was very gracious. And they had their own church actually, I'm sorry, I don't have it in my slides, but I was in Belgrade in 2012, and I made it a point of it to visit the small church where St. John became a bishop. I had to wait for like an hour to get permission to take pictures. I'm like, come on. And now I lost the pictures after all that. I mean, anyway. So when he arrived with his family, he and his brothers enrolled in the university in Belgrade, Beograd, however you want to say it. And he, at that time, enrolled in the faculty of theology. And he reflected later on in life that the collapse of Russia, and you can only imagine the impression it made on that generation. If you had just graduated from college and you were an idealist, graduate from Poltava Military Academy, and all of a sudden, the whole structure was just wiped away. Where does that put you? Okay, how do you process this? So he said this taught him that life was simply transient. Now we're talking about a government that was around for 1,000 years and only had 2 dynasties, right? Rurik and the Romanov. The Romanov dynasty was, I think, from 16th century. That's pretty stable. Now it's gone. Okay, so now he's following his heart. Enrolled in the faculty of theology, the whole family was dirt poor. He made a living by selling newspapers. He even went to the church offices to sell newspapers. No one knew that he had an advanced degree from a Russian law school. And he'd show up late to class full of mud and nod off a little bit while he was taking notes at the lectures. So an interesting thing, I don't see any of them here tonight, maybe 1 or 2 of the young bucks. But when he was in the faculty of theology, some of the zealous students formed a brotherhood, and this was the Brotherhood of St. Seraphim. And they organized meetings and lectures, and some of the bishops that had fled, Krapovitsky, Metropolitan Anthony was one of them, and another rather interesting personality of the era, Theophan of Poltava, gave talks to this brotherhood on a regular basis. And there are all types of famous ecclesiastical personalities that were part of this brotherhood. One of them was Father Cyprian Kern. He wrote kind of an interesting study in the Eucharist, and I believe in Palamas. He published it in Paris. He taught at St. Serge. And by the way, it was published in English. I might have it in a PDF if anybody's interested in it. It's out of print someplace. But he published some, I found them fascinating, reflections of these students and Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky. But he wrote it in his elder years. So it was a little bit critical at times. But it was just an absolutely fascinating insight to the kind of vibrancy of the spiritual and intellectual vibrancy of the Orthodox community at that time. So in 1926, Metropolitan Anthony tonsured Michael, a monk, and he gave him the name John after his distant relative, St. John of Tobolsk. That was his patron saint. And he was ordained a priest the same year, and he was assigned to a monastery where a lot of the Russian refugee monks were assigned. But he taught, his main assignment was that he taught high school first for 3 years, that is the catechism high school classes, in the region of Banat, which is just a driving distance from Belgrade towards Romania. So Banat is half in Romania and half in Serbia to this day, the region of Banat. So he taught high school there. Oh, they're the young bucks there. That St. Seraphim Brotherhood stuff is for you guys, okay? So, and then he was assigned to teach seminary in Bitola, which is in North Macedonia. Now, this is an extraordinarily beautiful area between Greece and Serbia proper. And who was his ruling bishop? Saint Nikolai Velimirovich. You really just can't make this up. I'm going to pause here and just show some of these slides. So this is St. John in Monterey, California. I think it was in 1955 or something like that. This is him as a young man, having graduated from high school. I think he was 15 years old. Maybe he hadn't graduated. I can't remember if this was the picture when he was 15. Oops. This is Saint Militi, the one who was buried in the sepulcher under the Protection Monastery cathedral altar. This is St. John of Tobolsk, his distant relative after whom he was tonsured. This is St. John when he graduated from law school in Kharkov. This is Metropolitan Anthony Krepovitsky. So he met Metropolitan Anthony actually when he had graduated from high school. Metropolitan Anthony was an extremely charismatic man. And everywhere he went, he had like limitless vocations to the priesthood. There was something in this man, some sort of a spark that took some of the brightest minds around him, and they all became priests. So when he was in Kharkov as the archbishop, and he would interact with government officials and members of the intelligentsia, he met St. John's father and found out that his son had this religious interest and was actually wanted to go to the Kiev Theological Academy. So he asked his father to bring the son to his office. I want to meet your son. And so then he developed this friendship with St. John and with the whole family. And then, by God's providence, they were together again in Belgrade. There he is as a young hieromonk when he was ordained a priest. And this is Lake Ohrid. This is near Bitol. This is the region of Macedonia. By the way, all the churches there are just so awesomely gorgeous because they mix kind of the Byzantine and the Slavic ethos. And every single one of them just has this transcendent quality about it. So has anybody read the prologue from Ohrid by St. Nikolai? One Person, Lives of Saints and Sermons for Every Day of the Year. Or how about his book, Prayers by the Lake? Okay, Prayers by the Lake, beautiful, beautiful books. I really, by the way, if anybody hasn't used the prologue of Ohrid for their daily devotions, I strongly recommend it, at least for a couple years, till you read it. But anyway, St. Nikolai was asked to write these things by friends of his because they call him the Serbian Chrysostom. And he wrote them during his summer break at Lake Ohrid. Another famous church of St. Panteleimon. Some of the ruins around the area of Bitol. And this is one of the seminary buildings. So St. John taught at this seminary from 1927 to 1934. And they had 400 to 500 students. The students were Serbians, Russians, Czechs, and Albanians. And in the town of Bitol, they also had Greek churches, and St. John would serve in Greek for the Greek community in this small town. Mixed population. They even have some mosques there in that area. And so St. Nikolai Velimirovich was his ruling hierarch. And he famously said to people, if you wish to see a living saint, go talk to Father John at the Bitol Seminary. So at this time, St. John became a devotee of St. Naum of Ohrid. St. Naum was a disciple of Cyril and Methodius. So Cyril and Methodius, the teachers of the Slavs, I'll say something about them a little later, they invented They were two brothers from Salonika. They were bilingual. They were probably half Slavic and half Greek. They spoke both languages. One became a hierarch, Cyril, the other didn't. Their first translation of the gospel into Slavonic, for which they invented an alphabet, can anybody tell me on whose altar that gospel was placed? On the altar of the Pope of Rome. Okay, so it wasn't solidified whether these regions would be under what patriarchate yet. Okay, so St. Nahum was one. What these two brothers did is they had an army of basically monastic translators, and everywhere they went, they started these like hesychastic skeets and started translating, and they converted these people by giving them two things, the gospel and the liturgy, in a language they could understand. Okay, so St. Nahum was known for healing people with mental disease, depression and other things. So St. John became a devotee to him when he was there, and he actually died on the feast day of St. Nahum. Okay, so at this time, a couple more pictures. This is him in the infirmary of the seminary. This is him with some of the students after he was consecrated a bishop. Who were his fellow professors at this seminary? Well, how about St. Justin Popovich? They taught there at the same time. I mean, you just can't write. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So St. Justin Popovich, he was probably the premier Serbian theologian of the last 100 years. He wrote a dogmatic theology and other important works. And that's him in his older years. That's him when he was teaching there, when they knew each other. Statue of him. There's St. Nikolai Velimirovich. I kind of like this photo of him because he was a very conversational person. And he would take a cab to the city from his house every day at 5 a.m. or something. Someone picked him up. I mean, these guys were just like made of steel. Another picture of St. John in Serbia after he became a bishop. Okay, let's continue. At this time of his life, when he was teaching at the seminary, this is when his kind of extraordinary asceticism was discovered. The fact that he would eat only once a day, and he never slept in a bed. So it was later learned that from the day he was tonsured a monk, he never slept in a bed. Well, we saw where he got that idea from, right? And he had a room. I was wondering if I wrote the whole quote down. I guess I didn't. But he had a room on the garden level of the building, and he didn't have curtains in one window. And so the students would see him at all hours of the night reading the scriptures. And this is when they noticed that he would walk the seminary grounds and pray over sick people, pray over the students at night. He did this when he visited Jordanville too. So he was practicing these late night prayer sessions. They also noticed that he had absolutely selfless concern for anybody who was ill, disadvantaged, got in trouble with the law, didn't have money to pay tuition, whatever. So also at this time, it began to be noticed that he had a speech defect. Some of this was due to a congenital situation with his jaw. There was a speech therapist who actually wrote an analysis of what happened to him. Part of it was some sort of an injury he suffered as a child, and it exacerbated when he fasted. So during Great Lent, he would only eat holy bread during the week and vegetables for a meal. And that kind of weakened him, and he couldn't enunciate his words clearly. He would be difficult to understand in his sermons. He also walked with a prosthetic shoe. One of his legs was slightly longer than the other leg. He had to use a cane. So he was a very frail person, but full of zeal. And so this is one of his students gave this testimony. I'm going to read it. His life was angelic. His meekness and humility were like that of the great saints, as was his ascetic discipline. His room was on the basement level with no curtains, and we saw him reading the Bible all night. He embodied all the Christian virtues. He would answer all of our questions. His answers were always concentrated, clear, full, and knowledgeable. If they were important, he would save them for trapeza. That is when he could answer them to everybody. Trapeza meaning the cafeteria. He was highly learned, having 2 university degrees in law and theology. He loved us, and we loved him. That's a beautiful testimony. Okay, so in this period of his life where he basically was formed as a priest, he received a telegram, the rector of the seminary received a telegram, that he had been elected Bishop of Shanghai. Think about that for a minute. You're getting sent to another culture, another part of the world. You're basically being exiled. So he went to Belgrade to protest. That's kind of a difficult task because you have to be obedient. So he said, I can't do it. I've got all these physical problems. What problems? Well, I have a speech impediment. Has anybody read his life? Do you know the answer he was given when he told them? Nobody? The answer was, so did Moses. See ya. So, okay. So he was consecrated a bishop on June 10th, 1934. He was the last bishop consecrated by Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky. So what happened, we learn in retrospect, was that Archbishop Dmitry of Harbin offered the Diocese of Shanghai to Metropolitan Anthony as sort of like a retirement diocese. And Metropolitan Anthony responded with these words, "My dear brother, I am already exceedingly old and unable to travel. But in my place, I am sending you someone who is like my very self, my very soul, my very heart. I send you Bishop John. This small, frail man, who almost looks like a child, is in reality a wonder of ascetic stability and exactness in this age of complete spiritual deficiency." So St. John arrived in Shanghai on November 21st, 1935, the anniversary of his priestly ordination. So I wanted to say something about what was going on in Shanghai, because if I don't think you'd really appreciate what this man actually went through and what he accomplished as a pastor there. And he was there for over a decade. Shanghai was the 6th largest city in the world. So it had 3.5 million people. And it was multi-ethnic. It had 3 politically independent districts, according to the 1935 census. So Archbishop John arrived in November 1935. The Chinese municipality, that was the majority of the city that was under the Chinese government, had 2 million Chinese and approximately 10,000 foreigners. The British international settlement, which was ruled by several countries in conjunction with each other, the Soviets had pulled out of that. The international sector had 28.5 thousand foreigners and 1.1 million Chinese citizens. The French concession, which was directly under France, and that's where most of the Russians lived, had 20,000 foreigners and 480,000 Chinese residents. In 1932, altogether, there were 65,000 Russians living in Shanghai. In 1937, the Japanese army surrounded the city and started taking control. This is before the full onset of World War II. When Pearl Harbor happened in 1941, the Japanese took over the whole city. And a lot of people fled. There was all types of, upheaval when this occurred. So lots of politics, folks. Lots of politics. Here are some examples. Two men named Karl Metzler and Nikolai Ivanov. Both of these men were formerly high-ranking diplomats in the Imperial Russian government to Peking and to China. They were both distinguished graduates of St. Petersburg University, so they were men of stature in the Russian community. And so they became the head of what was then called the, did I write it down here? The Russian Immigrants Committee. So the Russians had banded together, and for political representation, they had this committee, and they elected their chairman. And they elected both of these chairmen successively. What happened? The first one was assassinated in 1940. The second one was assassinated as he came out of a car with his wife. He was shot down in 1941. Okay, nobody knows who did it. You can blame the Japanese, you can blame, nobody knows. Okay? In this situation, everybody who was asked to take over the committee as chairman politely declined. So St. John agreed to be the temporary chairman of this committee. When World War II broke out, there was heavy fighting between the Japanese and the Chinese throughout the country. And Shanghai was not unaffected by these things. 600,000 Japanese soldiers died, and there were some estimates of 10 million casualties. I mean, we can't even, you know what, we can't get our mind around the carnage of World War II. It's just unbelievable in Europe and everywhere. So in 1937, and I'm skipping back and forth in this era now, before and after the war. As early as 1937, so St. John arrives in 1935. As early as 1937, there were actually pro-Soviet societies formed in China among the Russians and in Shanghai. And they had a large popularity among the youth. There are some estimates, I've seen estimates of 20%, 60%, 50%. Okay, if you say that many of the youth are joining pro-Soviet societies, how do you explain this? Well, the Soviets had a very effective propaganda campaign, and they showed patriotic films. And the kids would go there, and I was reading this testimony from one woman. She said, we went to these films, we didn't even care what the plot was or what was being said. When we heard the Russian language being spoken and saw the landscape of Russia, it inflamed us, okay? They wanted to go home. Not easy living in a foreign country. So when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, and St. John later wrote an extensive report of this whole era, by the way. I neglected to say that when he was in, the time that he was in Serbia and Bitol, he published a couple theological writings. He wrote a tract against the Sophiology of Father Sergius Bulgakov, which was very controversial at that time. And that controversy wasn't really put to rest until Vladimir Lasky, who came out of nowhere as a young man with, published a book called Sporo Sophie, The Controversy Over Sophia in Paris. And after that, there was no more controversy. We can't get into that talk tonight. The point being, but this is a very sophisticated kind of amalgamation of certain, I would say, almost Gnostic philosophies and Orthodox Christian theology. And Father Sergius Bulgakow was an absolutely brilliant thinker. There's no question about it. I'm not going to knock him. But his teachings about sophiology, I wouldn't be in favor of them, what I read. So he wrote something against that. He wrote the book that's now in English, The Orthodox Veneration of the Mother of God. He wrote a couple, he was an educated man. So later on he wrote, St. John, some of this stuff that I'm relating now comes from some of the reports that he gave to the synod later on. And he himself acknowledged that when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, and those of you who have studied World War II history, I'm sure you know this, they were greeted as liberators. They sprinkled them with holy water. Entire Soviet divisions surrendered on the spot. Okay, but when it was discovered or manifest that they were actually waging a war against the Russian people, that's when the whole country rose to the occasion. And the Soviets were very clever. They reopened the churches. In fact, in this period, they allowed the patriarchate to be reestablished, the election of Alexei I. And the people rallied to defeat the Germans. So in Shanghai, there was a massive pro-Soviet movement because they viewed this war as a defense of the homeland. And some of them actually went back. And one Russian woman recalled that when they won the war against Germany, this is how it was put. The Russian, how did she put it? The Russian community? No, the Russian, I don't know, okay, let's just say community. The Russian community in Shanghai literally lost their mind. Okay, that's why even in today's conflict, you see people waving the Soviet flag, and you're like, what are you doing? Well, that's what their parents and grandparents, they fought for the Soviet flag in this war. Unbelievable carnage in the Ukraine, the very place where St. John was from. So the propaganda in Shanghai from the Soviets was always, it's not the Soviet army, it's the Russian army that is fighting this war. Okay? So when they finally defeated them, they had all of these celebratory events, and toasts were made to Stalin and the Bolsheviks. So in 1947 alone, this is just 1 year, 5,000 Russians went back to the Soviet Union willfully. And the Soviets sent a captured German transport ship to fetch anyone who wanted to come. Now, soon the charade was revealed because they were screened when they were repatriated. Okay, and 1/3 of them were given prison sentences of 10 to 15 years for collaboration and subversion. So, and all the freedoms given to the church, those all things were brought back into order. So in August of 1945, I'm not going to talk more than an hour. Sorry about this. I went into the weeds a little bit too much on this era of his life. It's fascinating. But in 1945, the Soviets attacked Japan in Manchuria. And St. John's ruling Metropolitan Archbishop, Victor, and quite frankly, folks, I can't blame any of these people for anything they did. If you see the situation and you imagine what they were confronting, you can't judge anybody. So Archbishop Victor was first very pro-Japanese, very politically pro-Japanese. Why? Well, because he saw them as anti-Soviet. That would make sense from a traditional old world Russian believer, right? And then he switched sides on a dime and became a Soviet citizen in 1945. Okay? Can we blame him? I don't know. I don't think so. I won't judge him anyway. So St. John, now if you read some of the internet histories and stuff, people present something that St. John did as some sort of a fault to be repented of. I don't see it that way. So about this time, he asked St. John, that is Archbishop Victor, asked St. John for his opinion as to whether or not the church of the Russian church in China should go under the newly minted Moscow Patriarchate. St. John wrote a canonical opinion that they should, because they had no contact with the synod abroad for 5 years, and they had no idea who to contact or where to contact them. And you cannot be an autocephalous or autonomous church attached to no one. Now, in the context, so some people say he later repented. Where? Why? This was the correct opinion, actually. Okay, so why would they even entertain this? Well, because they were under the impression that the church was now liberated. When they saw the Soviet manipulation come behind this, St. John said, I will fully accept Alexei, we'll commemorate Alexei, but we should also commemorate Metropolitan Anastasi. We shouldn't stop commemorating him until the whole thing is clarified. So they commemorated both. St. John said our final decision should be when we see if this was a canonical election. So the Soviets came to show a movie on this election at the Soviet embassy. St. John refused to see the movie at the embassy. Consulate or whatever it was. So he saw the movie, and it was evident that there was only one candidate and it was an open vote. It wasn't a secret ballot. So at that time he said this is not a canonical election. When push came to shove, at the same time they reestablished contact with the synod abroad, which was now in Munich, by telegram. So St. John was the only bishop that did not break his loyalty to the synod abroad. At that time, they were all under the synod abroad. And St. John did not obtain Soviet citizenship or a passport. So you can see the man trying to become politically neutral in a very difficult situation. Now, after the communists took over, they put intense pressure on the non-Soviet Russians. And at that time, St. John had to make a decision, and this is an interesting story. An Orthodox, Chinese Orthodox Christian who was baptized, not a convert, as a baby. His name was Jonah Ma, and he worked for the pre-communist Chinese government in their intelligence services. And St. John knew about this man. And so this man was I believe he was in Peking. He was in another city. I didn't write it down. St. John contacted him for his opinion as to what he should do. And this man worked with Chinese priests. There's a moral to the story. And they had St. John granted Chinese citizenship. So basically got him out of this jam. This man, Jonah Ma, by the way, was arrested in 1958 by the communists, spent 15 years in prison. And in 1983, he came to the United States with his son, and he told the story of these events in 2005, and they were subsequently published at that time. So this tension, St. John had some tension with Archbishop Victor. Archbishop Victor forbade him to serve. And he was locked out of churches, and St. John ignored it. And when Victor came to Shanghai the local Chinese arrested him and sent him home. And the local Soviet consul in Shanghai gave St. John a choice. Either you accept Soviet citizenship or you commemorate the patriarch. In the end, he did neither. So, and during this time in 1946, he was in limbo with no decision or contact from the synod abroad. Finally, their decision came in May of 1946, and they made him an archbishop and basically independent. So that's how now, was this easy pastorally? I'm almost done. Am I boring you guys with this? No? Okay, good. So in 1947, there were 19,000 parishioners in Shanghai, 19,000 registered faithful in the churches. After this whole thing went down, 7,000 of them, with 11 priests, stayed with St. John in 6 churches. 12,000 with 5 priests went to Moscow in 2 churches. So you can see that public opinion was not monolithic on this. So can I account for that? Well, I mean, if I was there, maybe I would. Do I blame anybody? No, I wasn't there. Very difficult, confusing time. Okay, last thing, and then I'll say some things about his ministry in Shanghai. When St. John arrived in November 1935, in the same year, the League of Nations, that's before the United Nations, they put out a report about the status of the Russian emigre community in China. They estimated at that time that the unemployment among Russian men was 40%, especially when many of the Western corporations left under Japanese, Chinese conflict pressure. All of these educated Russians and workers, they lost their job like in a day. When tensions arose in Harbin and other places, many people went to Shanghai and more moderate places to live, and there was no place to live. So you had the situation of entire families and multiple families living in one-room apartments for years. Okay, they had a problem with suicide, believe it or not. The League of Nations report estimated that 22.5% of all Russian women aged 16 to 45 engaged in prostitution to feed their families. And this was welcomed among the higher class foreigners and other people there. Can you imagine this? So, by the way, St. John detailed the spiritual state of Russians abroad in a synod report in 1938, and he was oblivious to none of this. He knew the state of his people. Okay, so this is what I'm about to go over what he did now in Shanghai, but it occurred to me that his youthful asceticism, he never abandoned. He maintained one practice in particular wherever he was, in China, in Tubabao, how do you pronounce it? Tubabao. In Tubabao, in all these places, he would pray all night for his flock. In Tubabao, he'd go up into the lookout station and bless them from 4 sides at night with his cross. And it occurred to me that these practices were the only response of a noble and serious and sensitive soul. Because when you encountered continual heartbreak and human brokenness, what could you do except pray? And pray he did. Okay? So this was his daily routine. He would take a shower at 4 a.m. He went to midnight office, orthros, and divine liturgy every single day of his life and took communion at every liturgy if he didn't serve it himself. He served in every imaginable language, including Chinese. In fact, the reason why the Chinese took care of him is because he had great support among Chinese faithful and Chinese priests, because he viewed it, and he even said this in his synod report, that if you don't fulfill your destiny as a witness to orthodoxy to all peoples in all countries, then we Russians will disappear as a people. So he viewed his mission, and he did this in Paris and Western Europe, reviving the veneration of ancient Orthodox saints. He viewed his mission was to bring orthodoxy to everyone, not just protect his community in an insular manner. Okay, after proskomedia, he would pray in the altar for 2 to 3 hours. He had long commemoration lists. He visited the orphanage that he established, which I'll say something about in a minute, and he made hospital visitations and prison visitations every single day. None of this was planned, and he never had a watch. He told one of his spiritual sons, you should work for 6 hours. 6 hours a day you should spend with God, and 6 hours you should rest. And that's exactly how he lived. He had problems with his feet. I once heard the explanation that because he wasn't sleeping in a bed but in a chair, his feet would get swollen. So sometimes he would wear sandals, and if his feet were bothering him, he'd take his sandals off. And so people were scandalized, saying, oh, look, he's trying to be, ascetic, walking barefoot or something. It was simply because of the pain in his feet. He had tea at 5 p.m., and he ate 1 meal a day at 11 p.m. So when he arrived in Shanghai, and this is some pattern in his life, he immediately finished the stalled construction of the main cathedral, which was dedicated to the Mother of God, Surety of Sinners. On the second day, now he's only there for 2 days, based on several incidents he had experienced in 24 hours with abandoned children who were being abused by drunks and everything else. He made a proposition to a ladies' organization to start an orphanage. It was greeted very coldly. The leaders of the community were totally against it, because how are we supposed to build a cathedral and have money for an orphanage at the same time? Needless to say, the orphanage was started within 1 month when they rented 3 rooms and started taking care of 8 children. Okay, within the next 2 years, they had their own building, and over his whole time in Shanghai, they raised 3,500 kids. And some of these came to Tubabao and to San Francisco, where the St. Tikhon's Orphanage was reestablished in all these places. From the day he arrived, he began a focus on education among the children, revamping the catechetical programs in the public schools or the Russian schools. He attended the exams himself personally all the way through his time in San Francisco. He always attended the final exams, the oral exams in Verouchenia, they call it, in faith, in catechism. He surrounded himself with people zealous to do charity and who became completely devoted to his charities, basically sacrificed their lives for his orphans and his other projects. He personally oversaw not only the construction, but the fundraising of the cathedral. He basically lit a fire in the whole community. This is how, then he also started one orphanage himself, that was St. Tikhon of Zhejiang's orphanage. When other people in China saw the success he had, they moved the St. Olga orphanage from Harbin to Shanghai for his direction, and he brought an entire convent. I forgot the name of the first abbess. The second abbess was Abbess Adrienne, right? But anyway, they took care of the orphans. The nuns took care of the school and the orphanage for girls. Okay, he also started Ariadna, but the first one was somebody else. I forgot her name. The St. Philaret, the Merciful House, provided 200 meals a day to homeless people. Okay, this is how his community, in a report to the local synod, described St. John. Quote, "He is a torch that illumines our sinfulness, a bell which awakens our conscience, a clarion calling us to Christian exploits, a good shepherd which guides us so that we, living in a secular world of many cultures, and in this report they said, you know what, we don't even keep the fast, being in this kind of hectic, multicultural city. We might even for a minute break away from the earth, from the filth of sin, and turn our gaze to heaven. One beautiful story at this time is that they ran out of food at the orphanage, and the woman who ran this orphanage couldn't take it anymore, and he would come and visit, and finally one night she just lost her temper, raised her voice, and yelled at St. John and said, you know, it's nice for you to come in here and play with the kids and be all, bubbly, but we women who are working here, we have to look in the faces of hungry children all the time and put them to get bed hungry every night. And what are you doing about it? So he looked at her and he said, what do you need? Well, food would be a good start. So St. John went into the attic of the orphanage and did prostrations till dawn, so loud that the neighbors complained. And in the morning, an Englishman showed up who ran a food business and said, you know what, I've got a whole bunch of excess oatmeal. I'm going to throw it away unless you need it. We'll take it. So they loaded all of these sacks of oatmeal into the orphanage storeroom. St. John came downstairs, and the woman was totally ashamed, but in silence, he just left. That's St. John, isn't it? Another really beautiful story from this period of his life was that he used to visit prisoners. And Russians had a bad reputation for crime. He himself said that in his report to the Synod. He said, we're developing a bad reputation among all peoples because our people in desperation are turning to a life of crime. And often this was gang-related. There was kind of like cartel activity. So he went and visited a murderer in prison. He went on the day of Pascha. He took some sausage and some eggs and a little piece of the Russian, Easter cake, kolich or whatever they call it. And he told one of his helpers, come on, we're going to make a trip. And he got on a train and he went out to visit this murderer in prison who didn't expect him. And he walked in and he called him by name and he said, Christ is risen. And the man fell down on his knees, weeping, and he could only say, Vladika, Vladika. Okay? Guy's a saint. Okay, one of the people that he converted there was his worker, was Father Elias Yan. Father Elias Wen. By the way, Father Elias died in San Francisco at the age of 110. There's an adorable picture someplace on the internet, I couldn't find it, of him with his son. His son is 85 years old, okay, having tea. I was like, what's in that tea, Father? Give me some of that tea. So, but Father Elias attended liturgy at the San Francisco Cathedral every single day. He sang from the Kleros. So when you're a kid growing up and if you went to a weekday liturgy, you would take Father Elias's blessing. So anyway, okay, let's take a quick break. You know what? I'm going to have to end up this lecture here, skipping over a lot of stuff, but 5 minutes, and I'll be done. This is the Surety of Sinners Cathedral in Shanghai that St. John built. So a couple pictures of this. Commemorative plaque. The inside dome. Question?
Yeah, is it still in liturgical use or is it?
No, it's not. It's a museum. It's a picture of the altar. It's a picture of John as Bishop of Shanghai. This gentleman had a fascinating life, but we can't get into it. This is what I meant. I went too deep in the weeds in Shanghai for this. Okay, but you can't make this stuff up. But this is his biggest collaborator, and this man helped him get his whole flock, 5,000 people to Babao to San Francisco. Just him with his orphans. And I believe that's Father Elias. That's Father Elias in San Francisco. This is the Chinese, I think this was in 1996. They allowed a Pascha celebration, or maybe 2006. They allowed a Pascha celebration in the old cathedral. This is when St. John was locked out of the church and he served liturgy outside. It's like we Orthodox, if we're not fighting among ourselves, then. This is him and Tu Babao. Now, that's our next little, I'm sorry for the quality of this. By the way, this new book, Glorified in America, they have digitally enhanced the old photographs and even colorized some of them, and they are extraordinary quality. But I didn't have time to adequately scan them, so that's why poor quality of my scan. I wanted to say one last thing about his time in Shanghai. He established a lot of joyous feast days there, and one of the feast days that he established was the celebration of Cyril and Methodius, which they celebrate in Russia as the Day of Letters, Day of Culture, because through writing, culture comes. And so they invented the alphabet for the Slavonic peoples, Cyril and Methodius. To give you a little comparison, the Polish people became Catholics, which used the Latin language. It was 300 years before they had their own indigenous literature. The Bulgarians, the Balkan Slavs, and the Rus, they accepted Orthodoxy with Slavonic, and within 50 years, they had not only indigenous bishops, but indigenous publications in their own language. So they inherited Byzantium. Like, after all the Christological controversies and everything was settled, it was given to them, and they kind of ran with it. That's another topic. Very interesting stories of how the Kiev Caves Father Anthony Theodosius instilled this in their disciples, that you're being given a gift and you have to treasure it. Okay, I think the same could be said for all of us. All right, I'm going to go through the next portion rather quickly and then end the talk. When the armies of Mao Zedong approached Shanghai, it became very dangerous for the Russian community, and everybody left. Okay, and they made an appeal to Douglas MacArthur and Oscar Badger, and these two American admirals heeded the warning and started trying to facilitate the refugee evacuations. They took a poll in Shanghai through the Emigre Committee. 100% of the people said they would leave Shanghai. What does that tell you? Nobody wanted to stay. So to make a long story short, they began their evacuation in January of 1949, and they ended in May. It was a 20-day steamship trip to this uninhabitable island of Tubabao, which was hit by yearly typhoons. But no typhoon hit it while they were there. And the second they left, a typhoon hit it and wrecked all their buildings. Okay? So in August of 1941, St. John made his first trip to the U.S. Congress. And by the way, in his various trips to Washington, D.C., he established the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. It's a beautiful church. He went to Manila. He dealt with U.S. senators. They changed the law. He wrote all types. This is where his legal education came into play. And by the way, if you want to read more about this, because I'm going to have to skip it for our talk tonight, the book entitled Exodus by John Dunlap, published by St. Vladimir's a few years ago, is, I think, a really excellent presentation of all the data and all the dialogue and all the personalities involved. St. John then was appointed to Paris. His church was in a garage, but he had, there are a lot of things I was going to say, but let's just say one thing. He had the goal of everywhere he went of reviving the veneration of the Western Orthodox saints, and that has remained with us here as Orthodox in Western Europe and Western America, the Western Hemisphere rather. Where did that all start? Well, St. John was the major impetus for this. Okay? And he served in French, served in English. He served wherever he had to serve in the languages. And at this time, he visited churches in North Africa, in Tunis, Morocco. So, on November 21st, 1962, the exact day he arrived in Shanghai, he arrived in San Francisco at the request of his former flock, who had undergone a major schism over the building of the new cathedral. In San Francisco, and I'm only going to refer to this briefly, the community was factionalized, and they actually took St. John to court, and some of his fellow bishops even came to San Francisco to support people against him. They asked him years later, St. John, who was like behind all of this conspiracy? And his response was, the devil. He never took a factional approach. It was in all the newspapers, by the way. San Francisco Chronicle, everybody documented this. Famous picture of him in court saying nothing, wouldn't defend himself. He was exonerated of all charges, and the end result was they built and consecrated the cathedral and started the Russian school, and everything else that he was doing before, he did again. I could say so much more about Tubabao. Let's just say that 15,000 Russian refugees went through Tubabao with his help. It's extraordinary. He foresaw his death, and he died in Seattle. The room that he died in next to the Seattle Church of St. Nicholas is a chapel to this day. And as I mentioned before, he was buried in San Francisco. And some of the bishops that might not have taken his side actually presided over his canonization in 1994. So I'm going to show some interesting pictures, and I really would stay for this. But I wanted to conclude by saying this. Why is he a saint? Because he listens to us, and his presence is felt. And he has a concern for everyone who turns to him. And he's really extraordinary for that. And his reputation for holiness, for simplicity, for purity of heart, his devotion to prayer and the daily services, all of these things, he was a complete man of God. And it's an extraordinary thing that of all places in the world that he could be buried, he's buried in San Francisco. Okay? It's like a little beacon of heaven. Now I want to end with some very great pictures, guys. Like that one that didn't come out in the, okay. St. John is a younger bishop. This is him with the Luciano family, Bishop Peter's family, in Europe in a train after World War II. This is him with the Mothers of the Lesna convent in France. This is him in Tunis, serving the liturgy. People say that's uncreated light. I believe it, but there's also a window behind the altar, just saying, okay? This is the cathedral he came to in San Francisco. It's called the Old Cathedral, the Stare Sabor. It's actually, I have the details of it, and I didn't have time to put it into my talk, but it was minted in redwood by English shipmen. And they brought the windows. It's from the turn of the previous century. It was bought by the Russians in 1930, and Archbishop Tikhon served there from like 1935 until 1962. It's a magnificent church, and it has these gorgeous windows with the Beatitudes and some of the sayings of Christ. It's really a masterpiece. It's all wood, redwood. You can see all the carving and how they beautifully put the new Orthodox icons there. Some of these pictures, I don't know what happened. I apologize. There is a rumor that there are locks on the iconostasis door, and they are there, because apparently after liturgy one day, somebody barged in on St. John, and he was levitating. Person almost had a heart attack, so that's part of the lore, okay? That's part of If you go to the old cathedral, they have his mantia there, and they put it on top of you as a blessing. Bishop James is there. He does that service. The cathedral was dedicated to the Virgin Joy of all who sorrow, and so is the new cathedral. St. John with his orphans in St. Tikhon's house. This is his one room, and I don't have a picture of his chair in the slideshow. But in this one small room, and by the way, I don't have a picture of his library shelf, and he has books in all types of languages, Latin, Greek. It's unbelievable, his library there. But that's his icon corner. He has a picture of his parents over his desk, picture of Metropolitan Anastasi. There's his parents. On the left is his chair where he slept, but I don't have it in the picture. This didn't come out either. This is the new cathedral, very famous. I wanted to put this picture in. Can you see the Golden Gate Bridge? Maybe this is not the one. Well, anyway, you can see the cathedral from the Golden Gate Bridge on a clear day. If you're driving into San Francisco, if you look out towards the west, you'll see the cathedral. It's Rocor. Okay, there's the cathedral services. I'm speeding through this. This is the sepulcher. I don't have any pictures of it. Go to orthodox360.com. But it didn't have the iconostasis at that time. He was buried in the middle of the room. But you can see some of the frescoes by Pimen Safronov on the side. Okay, please, please. All right, good. This is my favorite picture of St. John, by the way. I think the warmth of his soul really comes through this picture. This book was published, as we see here, in Moscow in 2005. Is that where you bought it? Yeah. Catherine bought it. Catherine Schooley, our own beloved parishioner, Catherine Schooley, bought the book in Moscow and opened it to quite a surprise. And the surprise was a picture of Catherine Schooley graduating from high school with St. John. You see St. John in profile? You see him? You only see his profile. It's kind of hard to see. I put a yellow arrow right on his head. And that's Catherine with the red arrow. You can see she's getting his blessing. And Catherine won an academic award. Is this your graduation? Yeah. That's Catherine. What a lovely picture. What a lovely group. You know, just radiant. So Catherine graduated from a rather small class, I would say, in a parochial school. I wonder if she got a good education. Well, considering the fact that she graduated valedictorian at UC Berkeley, I would imagine that she did. And then went to medical school and practiced medicine for 35 years. So I would say that pretty solid education there at the St. John Academy. This is the church in Seattle. And he died in front of the Kursk icon of the Mother of God, which also healed St. Seraphim. Used to be kept in San Francisco. Today it's kept in New York. So if you're ever in New York, maybe you'll have the opportunity to venerate it. And he's venerated all over the world. And here's an icon from Romania. Anyway, and the last slide didn't come out. All right, that's all I got, guys. Thank you for staying a little extra.